Thank you all for joining us this April 10th. We're talking with Eric about Park Fescue and Trip Seed, and Steve about winter and spring geese. As always, I want to start with acknowledging our Forever Green funders, the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, Clean Water, Land and Legacy Amendment, Soldiers Vision Philanthropies, and the Knight Foundation, among other generous donors that make this work possible. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about Hard Fescue. Last time I talked to this group, I talked about some of the selection work we're doing for foliar shade adaptation. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, more about the seed production aspects, so the work we're doing there and like some of the barriers we might be facing and some of the solutions, and then also a little bit about how we're thinking about driving demand for the seed. For those of you who don't know, there's quite a bit of turfgrass seed production in northern Minnesota by Roseau and Warroad, maybe 40, 50,000 acres a year, something like that. So almost all the acreage is in perennial ryegrass seed production. So Nancy Elke, of course, has worked in that area for a long time. And that works very well. What they do is they, it's shown here in the first figure there, seed perennial ryegrass and spring wheat at the same time in an intercropping system. And then as that grass seed grows, it grows much more slowly than the wheat, kind of hangs out underneath the wheat. The farmer produces wheat that first year as a cash crop while the perennial ryegrass is establishing. Perennial ryegrass needs a vernalization period, of course, it's perennial to produce seed. And then that wheat stubble actually helps catch snow, so it's a good winter protection for perennial ryegrass. And perennial ryegrass is not all that winter hardy, so that's good. And then after wheat harvest that first year, the perennial ryegrass takes off as you get to late summer and early fall. And then the next year you harvest the grass seed, and they only harvest that first year usually. There are things you could do to get multiple years, but they don't do it. So it's a 2-year cycle. So now on to hard fescue. Hard fescue is one of these fine fescues, this group of grasses that we've studied for a long time that show really good, they do really well under lower inputs for lawns. And there's increasing demand for these grasses. So the thought is, well, if there's increasing demand for these grasses, could we grow them in northern Minnesota to sort of diversify what they're doing? Like putting all your eggs in the perennial ryegrass basket is probably not real wise long term. So I started this a long time ago. We had this variety MNHD, or this population that we've been working on. And we started doing research up there, collaborating with Nancy Elke and her team. And one of the first things we tried was, well, why don't we just do it like we do with perennial ryegrass? Just plant them together in the spring and see what happens. And consistently we had problems because one of the nice things about hard fescue is it's slow growing and less mowing, so that people like that, right? But in this system, we don't like that because the wheat actually sort of overwhelms it. So the light quality and light quantity under that canopy is just so low that the hard fescue struggles. So Jillian Gerville, a grad student in our group, and others have been working on agronomic solutions to this. We've also been doing some breeding work as well to select hard fescues that can better handle that low light quality, low light quantity environment. So we've got some populations that we'll be testing soon there. So it didn't work. This traditional system didn't work. So Jillian, as part of her thesis, put together a number of options that could be alternatives to the spring wheat intercropping scenario in the spring. So I'll go through each of them to kind of talk about why we chose them and how they set up here. So the first 3 treatments are really testing the old system, right? So if you plant hard fescue and spring wheat together, what is the harvest for hard fescue the next year? Of course, the controls would be spring wheat alone and hard fescue alone. So in this case, we're saying, well, what if you just planted hard fescue in the spring, in May? What does that do? Of course, you're not going to get a cash crop that first year, but if you get a really good yield the second year, maybe that's good enough. One of the things about hard fescue is it's much more valuable than perennial ryegrass per pound. So it could be that loss of revenue during the first year is not a big deal. The second 2 treatments here that I've grouped are just hard fescue alone, with the hope that you could still get a harvest the next year. The challenge here is July too late? If you planted hard fescue in July, are you going to get a harvestable crop the next year? That's kind of the question. June probably works, but these are hard fescue alone crop. There's no intercropping. What if we just seeded hard fescue late spring, early summer? Could we get a crop the next year? Treatment 6, 7, 8 are sort of the same idea as the spring wheats intercropping, but with hybrid rye in the fall prior. So these were seeded in 2023, and then you get a cash crop with the rye in 2024, and the hard fescue would be harvested in 2025, and then the controls. These treatments 9 and 10 are dormant seeding treatments. So dormant seeding would just be seeding after it's too cold to germinate in the fall. It just sits there during the winter, kind of works its way into the soil through freeze thaw. Then it gets a head start in the spring is the idea. So in this case, where either treatment 9 is just dormant seeding hard fescue, just throwing the seed out there and then harvesting it 2 summers later, right? So this is 2023, they would establish all through 2024, vernalize during the next winter, and then hard fescue harvest 2025. And the next treatment is doing that same thing, but then putting the spring wheat as an intercrop on it, intercropping in the spring of 2024. So now the hard fescue's got a little bit of an advantage probably because it's been dormant seeded. So as soon as conditions allow, it's going to germinate and get going. And it might not be a huge time advantage, but it could be just enough to kind of keep up with that light quality problem we talked about. So a lot of data was collected. The main thing we're interested in though is yield. So here are the results. We did this at, Jillian did this at 2 locations. So these are the 10 treatments, and this is showing seed yield. And I'll go through these individually to show some interesting things. So this is the seed yield of hard fescue in 2025, right? So some of these were seeded in late 2023, some were seeded in early 2024, some were seeded in the summer of 2024, but these are all the harvest. This is all harvest information for 2025. So treatments 1, 4, 6, and 9 would be hard fescue seeded alone in May, June, September, and dormant seeding the September the previous year or dormant seeded the previous year. And at both locations, the yields were all very good. So these are all acceptable, agronomically acceptable, make a bunch of money yields. So this is not an issue. Of course, with all of these treatments, you don't have a cash crop, but you don't need a cash crop for the treatments. While you do need a cash, we'll talk about that in a bit. If you're not taking advantage of that field early in the summer, you would be lacking that cash crop. Here is July. I wanted to point this out. So in the previous slide, I highlighted treatment 4, which was June. July worked at one site, but not the other. And that's sort of what we might expect, that July is getting a little late. So it's going to be kind of on the edge. From like a Forever Green perspective, July or like late July would be nice because then you could put your hard fescue seed in after you like harvest camelina, for instance, right? So that's the idea with this July treatment. Is July acceptable to get yield the next year if you put it in after a winter annual? Treatments 2 and 10, this would be the treatment 2 is the standard intercrop at the same time in the spring. You can see both times, as I told you we had observed before, didn't work very well, right? So very low seed yield, unacceptable. The dormant seeding in the fall, late fall, and then putting the spring wheat in the spring actually worked okay. So this is one where you'd have to kind of run the numbers. We're going to have another year of seed production here, but this one's probably like economically viable, I would say, because you have the cash crop with the spring wheat, plus an acceptable, probably a moderate hard fescue harvest. The other thing you can do here, though, hard fescue, unlike perennial ryegrass, hard fescue you can harvest for multiple years. So that kind of has to come into your equation too, right? Like, sure, that first year of hard fescue seed production might not be great, but it's a perennial crop, so you get another year or 2 after that. So that has to be part of the.
Is the spring wheat planted like at the normal spring wheat time?
Yeah.
Is it possible to push that back a little bit?
You could. That's one thing you could do. We haven't played around with spring wheat planting dates. I don't know if the farmers are going to be that excited about it because of just when they're harvesting stuff, right? But that's a good idea. I don't think to date we have not looked at that. I don't think. Nancy, have we looked at that? I don't think so. Good idea though. It's something to think about. maybe in combination with the dormant seeding.
Yeah.
So treatment 5, what was the difference between the two locations? Like, did one just have really bad was it precipitation?
Weather was all very similar. It's just slightly different soils and, I don't know, I can't remember from the documentation, but there wasn't huge environmental difference. They're not that far apart, actually.
Okay.
But, I think it just speaks to sort of it's right on the edge. Like any little thing can kind of tip it over. Cereal rye treatments, inconsistent, similar to what we saw with the July date. So in summary, like if you weren't worried, if a farmer was not worried about the cash crop during the establishment year, hard fescue has a pretty flexible establishment window. Intercropping's going to reduce yield of hard fescue in the first production year. Like I said before, that might be okay if the cash crop is good enough and you're getting that additional perennial year because of the perenniality of the species. When intercropping, it's probably better to give hard fescue head start, so that idea of delaying the cash crop might work, but dormant seeding probably is our best solution. One of the nice things about dormant seeding is you don't have to worry about field conditions in the spring, so it's often very wet, it's cold, it's just there, right? You don't have to worry about getting out there. Once established, we can get at least 2 good years of hard fescue seed production in northern Minnesota. Once in a while, a third year. We think there's some trying some agronomic things to maybe push that third year. I think, however, that the economics work pretty well to do hard fescue without a companion crop. So even if you seeded hard fescue in May and didn't have a companion crop, the seed yield is going to be so good that next year, plus the fact you don't have to go, you'll get another year of good seed production and maybe another year after that, that the economics are going to work out so well that it doesn't matter. Now, convincing farmers about that's a different story, right? But the other thing to know about hard fescue, much lower inputs in terms of production than perennial ryegrass. Almost no fungicide needs right now in Minnesota. You don't have to spray for rust, for instance. And the fertility needs, like nitrogen fertilizer, is probably like a third of the need for compared to perennial ryegrass. So the input costs are lower. The seed yield's a little lower, even at maximum, but not a lot lower. And the value of the seed is quite a bit higher. Sometimes, maybe not always double, but sometimes close to double, like certainly 50% higher.
So the companion crop area, you're going to have higher inputs just based on fertilizer.
Fertilizer for the spring wheat, you're bringing your combine out there an extra time. I mean, there's all these other costs, labor, time, fuel, things like that. We'll get back to that a little bit later. Or like I said before, we are selecting hard fescues and trying to develop hard fescues that can do well in the intercropping system, because it could be that if we can improve their shade performance in the kind of performance in a low light environment, that this will work out even better. Okay, I'll come back to like next steps for that work in a bit. But first I want to talk about, and I think this kind of applies to other.
There was a chat question that I missed, so sorry if we could just jump to that. Pete LaFontaine said, sorry for the one-on-one question, but is the idea that you're solving 2 market issues? 1, shade tolerant fescue seed for lawns, and 2, helping seed producers find extra.
Yes, that's a good point. That's why this is so nice. So hard fescue, so the fine fescues are pretty shade tolerant. So you'd usually recommend fine fescues. There's 5 of them in some combination for shade. Hard fescue, however, if you're just looking at the change in light quality, so change in red to far red ratio, does not do as well as the other fine fescues. So there's a need for breeding work to make that better anyway. So that's exactly right. If we can find a hard fescue that can grow better in this intercropped environment, it's going to also probably be better for lawns, right? So it's kind of it's a nice situation to be in, where you get that double advantage.
Where is the increasing demand coming from that?
What did you say?
Where the increasing this slide?
Oh, we're gonna move on. This is like
that's
this is like a new section.
okay.
Moving on to the next section. Yeah.
Fair.
So now I want to talk about some of the work we're doing that I think. So one of the issues we've had is that we have a lot of consumer data saying that they want grasses that have the attributes and characteristics that hard fescue has. And when I talk to sort of national seed company folks, they say there's a need for hard fescue seed, clear need. They can't find it. But then when you talk to sort of the marketers who work with seed producers, they'll say, well, there's hardly any hard fescue seed sold. But the problem is it's kind of a chicken and the egg problem, right? So if there was more hard fescue seed, it would get sold. But the other thing we can do is think about, are there other ways to increase demand for these lower input grasses? I'll talk a bit about that here. And one thing we've really kind of homed in on is that the turfgrass world, like public agencies can be a big driver of turfgrass seed sales, like governments, municipalities, these kind of non-private organizations. They use a lot of turfgrass seed. Think about the DOT, think about Minneapolis Park Board, think about, all public utilities. Excel uses a lot of grass seed, right? But one of the problems, though, is that a lot of these agencies or entities really prioritize immediate costs. So the bid goes out and they take low bid, and then bad grass seed gets sold, used. There's a lot of outdated specifications. There's a good story about in the perennial ryegrass world, there's this variety called Linn perennial ryegrass, Linn, and developed decades ago. And it's awful. It's the worst quality grass you've ever seen. And it doesn't get used very much anymore at all. But there's one guy who grows it in Oregon, and he gets a premium for the seed because it's required in outdated specifications. So,
Wait, what are those specifications?
like like DOT says you've got to use this mix on a roadside, or a public utility says you have to use this mix in utility projects, those kind of things. And if it's in that specification, they have to use it.
Yeah.
So this guy's selling the worst grass seed for the highest price because it's required, because the specification was written in 1975 or whatever.
And no one.
It never changed.
Changed.
Yeah, who
Nobody changed it.
Even though it's crap.
Too hard to change it, right? Oh, how am I going to change it? I'll just
Yeah.
That's terrible.
Grass is grass, right?
Yeah, right. The other thing is, if we can move public agencies in this direction, it's an opportunity to influence public cultivar adoption, and actually it increases the availability of the seed, right? Because if the DOT, for instance, is buying lots of a variety, there's going to be more of that variety. It's going to find its way into Home Depot and things like that. It's difficult to change these processes, but I'm talking about how we've done it here. So we've done a lot of work, collaborative work with the DOT over the years, and it started like in 2010. And it was just a long process. Like, let's figure out which species you should be using. Let's figure out how to manage them properly, how to establish them properly. And eventually we got to a point where we were optimizing mixtures and thinking about what should the mixtures be for roadsides, and also should there be different mixtures in different parts of the state. So that's what happened here. We ended up recommending 2 different boulevard mixtures, one for northern Minnesota, one for southern Minnesota. And as part of that process, hard fescue did really well. So now if you look at this, hard fescue is 16% by weight, and actually more in the northern mix than the southern mix. So let's say 15 to 20% by weight of all required boulevard mixes for the DOT, where it used to be 0, right? So that's a lot. That's a huge increase. And actually just having a variety and a list like this in one state is enough to like really drive production, because they use so much seed. And then we worked with the DOT on a process to make sure the cultivars are always updated. So now they actually have a cultivar list associated with these requirements, and they have good varieties listed, right? So we can get our variety in this list, which isn't such a big problem. Now the seed companies know, hey, if I produce more seed, it's going to get used for sure because it's required in the MnDOT spec. So when MnDOT puts out a call for proposals for a project, it'll say you must use the Southern Boulevard mix or whatever. So then the contractor has to they have to buy the seed mix from a local seed vendor. The seed vendor has to fill it with varieties on this list. And now hard fescue's on the list and a big part of the seed. Before, it was mostly Kentucky bluegrass, bad varieties of Kentucky bluegrass. And now Kentucky bluegrass is 5%, right? 5% of the mix by weight. We're doing the same thing with the Met Council. Met Council sponsors a lot of research in our group on lawn water conservation. This could be like community outreach. It could be like better technologies for irrigation controllers, things like that. Another thing is species use, right? So we get a lot of questions about, we'll get this question a lot from like park districts or cities. How can we get our residents to use more drought tolerant grasses, right? So one thing we've been thinking is, well, what if we use the same approach as the MnDOT approach and try to optimize mixtures for lawn water conservation? So when we're giving talks to, let's say, master gardeners or something, we'll talk about hard fescue and other grasses. Like, where do I find it? Well, it's kind of a complicated answer, right? But imagine that there's just some sort of branded or state blessed mix called University of Minnesota Lawn Water Conservation Mix, then the seed vendors could just sell that, right? And there could be an approval process and so forth. So that's what we did. I just want to point out, these are all the mixtures and it's showing all the different species. But hard fescue is a big part of many of these mixtures. So it's very likely at the end of this, hard fescue, that'll be another avenue for hard fescue sales. So we put in 4 mixture trials around the Twin Cities and different locations that are publicly accessible. The plan is to work with the Board of Water and Soil Resources on this, kind of like they have recommended conservation acreage mixes, would be the same idea. And then people could just look for whatever the brand is for that mix. So what's next in terms of this overall work? As part of the more recent Forever Green funding we got, and some people in the room are a part of this project, there's a component to look at whether consumers care if their seed is produced more locally. We are very interested in branding and labeling kind of to this lawn water conservation mix. There's a lot of efforts out there by seed companies to have there's an example here, the TWCA, Turfgrass Water Conservation Alliance. They'll label mixes and say these have been determined to be water savers or whatever. These are sort of industry consortium labels, let's say. But we're interested in, do those work? Or is there some other way that we should communicate lawn water conservation mixes? That's funded by the Department of Ag, led by Sheng-Yin Yu and Mike Barnes. Back to the hard fescue, that example we were talking about, the sort of, if you didn't plant a cash crop, maybe it's a better financial result. We need to quantify that. It's been it's something the farmers need to see the numbers, right? So that's going on as part of that Forever Green money. And then taking all this information I talked about and other things, we're going to produce a production guide. Nancy's group produced a production guide for printer ryegrass several years ago. Same idea here. It's been really a struggle to get farmers to take the plunge on hard fescue. So like really getting a good economic case and good agronomic case, I think, is really important. Part of the agronomic case is analyzing decades and decades of prairie ryegrass research and more recent hard fescue research to look at the differences in fertilizer recommendations and things like that. And Jake Youngers is leading that work. Well, it's been difficult to get farmers to grow hard fescue. We finally have one production field up there. There's about 90 acres that went in after Camelina, and it got seeded, I think, almost in August, which is very, very late. So we'll see. It could be that there won't be a crop this year, but the farmer is considering putting spring wheat in on top of it. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. But it's nice to have one field. I think that's the biggest way to drive adoption, is like it worked for somebody, right? And it paid off. Here's a list of all the people who worked on all the things I talked about. And like I said, we have this newer Forever Green funding. Jess is part of it, doing some ecosystem services work. Jake's doing sort of meta-analysis of some of the results. Nancy's helping with the production guide, Sheng-Yin Yu on the economics, and Mike Barnes on the seed labeling work. And with that, I'll take any questions that you might have.
Pete LaFontaine, he was asking about why someone would want to purchase fescue rather than grass, you said.
So fine fescues, so the comparison would be like fine fescues compared to Kentucky bluegrass, right? So Kentucky bluegrass would be the most commonly used lawn grass in Minnesota. So like Kentucky bluegrass under ideal conditions is really nice, but it needs more water, it needs more fertilizer, it gets more disease. It's it's slower to establish. So it doesn't really, it grows more quickly, so you have to mow it more. So there's all these input related reasons that you would want to use fine fescue. And fine fescues also, similar to Kentucky bluegrass, they have very good winter performance. Like they're not going to die during the winter. So that's important here, right? That they won't die during the winter. So it's a low input grass, low inputs, low resource inputs, but still looks really good. It also is much more shade tolerant.
Do you have a sense of why the hard fescue has more consistent seed yield compared to perennial ryegrass?
So in Minnesota, perennial ryegrass, like if you grew perennial ryegrass in Oregon, you can get multiple years. But you could get maybe a second year here if things work further well, but you can't get beyond that. And we think it has to do with its poor winter hardiness. The sort of resources it expends producing seed that first production year, it just doesn't have enough time and energy to kind of get ready for the next seed production cycle. Plus, stands just decline over time quite a bit in a crop that has poor winter hardiness. So that's another challenge. So I'd say probably mostly it has to do with winter hardiness.
Interesting. Yeah. What about roots? Like, are the root systems bigger?
They're probably similar root systems. Yeah, it more has to do with they're both fibrous root systems. They're not probably in terms of how deep they are, probably not all that different. Hard fescue is much better. That does not need to use as much water though, so it's just more naturally, more inherently drought tolerant, for instance. And they just have better winter protective mechanisms, whatever those might be.
Interesting. What about the like do you have off the top of your head net or gross like income?
So I don't have it off the top of my head, but when we've run the numbers before, it clearly works better to just have the big production without the cash crop.
Okay.
But we'd like to dig into that more, and start to factor in like equipment and things like that as well.
Yeah.
What
about the price? Like, what is the price? Do you know what the price
like
would be?
price per pound?
Yeah.
Kind of varies, but perennial ryegrass might be, I don't know what it is right now, 75, 80 cents. Yeah, it goes up and down between like 75 and $1.10 or something. And hard fescue might be on the low end at $1.10 or something, and go up to like 130 or 140. So the price per pound is much different, but the yield of perennial ryegrass under ideal conditions is higher. But it's not that much higher. Maybe a couple hundred pounds per acre or something. The other thing about perennial ryegrass, you can lose it due to winter. So if we have a severe open winter in Roseau, they'll have damage on perennial ryegrass. Hard fescue, you're not going to lose to a winter. Now, we haven't grown hard fescue on vast acreages yet in northern Minnesota. There could be problems that we've not picked up in research plots. So that's kind of an unknown, right?
Okay.
So I'll be giving updates on how spring and winter pea breeding have been going. And this talk is kind of split up into 3 parts. And I'm actually going to start off by talking about projects that were not funded by Forever Green. They're actually largely funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, but they are both really exciting and impactful for future work that we do in the pea breeding. So, and then I'll switch to talking about winter peas and spring peas. So the first thing I want to talk about is the development of 2 new reference genomes for peas. In peas, there has historically been one main reference genome that was published, when was that, Pacredi? 2019, for a French cultivar named Camior. But the assembly was not very good. So as you'll see in a little bit, peas have a large genome with lots of repetitive elements, kind of like maize, which has been challenging historically to do this reference genome development. But sequencing shenanigans are getting better. And so Bob and I decided to target these 2 varieties. So Fallon is a spring pea developed in the United States. It was released by the USDA by a number of people, one of whom was Gary Mulbauer's dad, Fred Mulbauer. And then the other variety, which I'm really excited about, is Melrose, which if you guys have listened to any of my talks ever, I always mention Melrose because it's one of my favorite winter peas. I'm not really going to go into all the details of how the reference genomes were made, but we collaborated with Hudson Alpha to do it. But in the end, we got 2 really high quality assemblies. P is a diploid with 7 pairs of chromosomes, so we have assemblies, and I will give you some details. So this slide kind of compares our 2 new assemblies. Let's see if I can do. So here's the original Camior reference genome. There is now a newer Camior, which is much better than the first one, and then here are our 2 new Fallon and Melrose assemblies. And so the main things to really look at in this busy table are the number of scaffolds. So, the first Camior version, there was 24,000 scaffolds assigned to those 7 chromosomes. And now we have scaffolds that cover the entire chromosomes, which is pretty amazing. There's also very few gaps. So all the contigs align really nicely along the entire scaffold. So they were able to power through all these highly repetitive elements, which normally it's really hard to figure out like how this chunk matches with this chunk if they look the same. But with the newer sequencing approaches, we were able to align on that. shenanigans. So it's pretty exciting. I just mentioned there's this other Chinese variety, which had a relatively decent assembly, but the problem with that Chinese assembly is that it's hard to get a hold of germplasm from China. So it makes it hard for researchers to use it. Whereas Fallon and Melrose are both publicly accessible cultivars that anyone can order from anywhere in the world and use for research. So these reference genomes will help hopefully empower future work, like the next project I'll talk about after this. So this is just a little more information about the Fallon reference genome. So like I mentioned, PISA have lots of repetitive elements. So out of the 3.8 billion base pairs, 86% of them were repetitive elements. As most of them belong to this group known as ogres, which can be like over 10,000 base pair long repetitive chunks, which is pretty wild. But I was comparing to maize, and it's actually a really similar profile. So I thought that was interesting. But so we have about 13–14% of the sequences which are more unique, and that's the gene space that we are most interested in. So we have this new Fallon reference genome. This is kind of like the first step of developing updated resources for the pea research community. So then the next step is trying to characterize more germplasm. And so this project was done in collaboration with Ninoy Bandio when he was at North Dakota State University. Now he's at North Carolina. And so in this project, Illumina sequencing was done for about 300 really genetically diverse pea lines that were selected to represent much of the pea genetic diversity from around the world. And so those Illumina sequences were mapped back to the new Fallon reference assembly. And, you know, hundreds of millions of polymorphic SNPs were identified amongst that set of accessions. So then we took about an additional 1,174 accessions, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And we did really low depth skim sequencing for these to make it affordable. But then using the SNP data set from these 300 diverse lines, the missing data from these 1,174 were imputed based on those. So this is like a huge expansion of the genetic characterization of the pea germplasm. So like over the years, there's been maybe 600 to 900 accessions that have been like markers have been SNPs or SSRs have been run on. So this is like a huge expansion of what we know about the genetic diversity of peas. So here are where our additional 1,174 lines come from, more or less. So I included, there are about 900 lines that we had geographic information on where they came from. They're largely land races and like locally adapted cultivars, stuff like that. And then there's this group here that are like a separate domestication event localized to Ethiopia. I included winter pea lines or anything that I thought was winter pea. So this is kind of like the base of the winter pea breeding program. And then we have some wild accessions, including some from the subspecies Eladius, which is the wild progenitor of domesticated bees. From those imputed SNPs, there were about 117 million SNPs, which is just a monstrously huge marker data set, which is pretty exciting. And so I wanted to try to understand the genetic diversity using this set, but in order to do that, we need to make this SNP data set a little more manageable. So we did some quality filtering, reducing markers where there's too much missing data, and then some pruning. So this LE pruning is basically in any 200 base pair SNP window, removing any SNPs that had a correlation of greater than 0.2. So it's just keeping the most diverse SNPs from the whole set. So then we had about 3 million. And using those 3 million SNPs, I ran a principal component analysis. There's more work to do with this data set, like especially looking at population structure, things like that. And Prakriti has got a whole project on that, which hopefully she can talk about next year. But here is what it looks like when you map out the 3 largest principal components. So this is kind of the world's diversity of peas, and I apologize that the dots are really tiny and the colors are kind of hard to see. The coloration is based on information from the USDA, which can be a bit spotty, so there's a lot of missing gray ones. And then you have land races, which these are mostly lines from China. And then we have these lines that are called cultivated, which can mean anything from probably land races to cultivars. That's a bit ambiguous, but it's pretty much things from all over the world. And then some wild ones, which these are the Pisum sativum subspecies Eladius, the wild progenitors. Let me move this thing out of the way so I can point.
What
Oh.
what are the land race?
What does it mean?
Yeah.
It's like a historical variety that has been selected by farmers or growers in a region over a long period of time. So not necessarily active modern breeding efforts, but through generations of being used in a place, it's been selected and adapted for that region. So I just thought this was interesting. I'll just talk about a little bit of what I found here when I tried to look at the provenance of these lines. So as I mentioned, all these purple ones are from China, which is interesting. We're capturing a lot of this diversity and the first principle component here, which is interesting. This group here are largely from Tajikistan and Afghanistan. And then we have these Eladia successions, and then we have more from Turkey and Azerbaijan and Russia here. Most of these lines separating in the second principal component are winter peas, or things that are winter pea-like. And then these intense clusters here are groups of accessions from India. And I was thinking about it more like why there are these tight clusters. And
The same thing.
well, yeah, definitely they're the same thing. But why? Because they're grown over large regions and they have all these names, and why were they collected? But India is a place with many languages spoken across an area. And there was probably a variety that was grown for a specific purpose over a large area. And in each place, they were calling it a different thing for their own language. And when whoever came to collect all these accessions, they grabbed all these different things, but they were collecting the same thing. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. There's lots of diversity here to look into. Okay, and the last thing I'll talk about for the genetic resource are the precious babies that I've been working on here. And of course, I'm talking about this NAM population. So this is, we've got F5 seed that has been produced or is it being produced. And so the NAM stands for Nested Dissociation Mapping Population. Fallon, which we have developed a new reference genome for, is the hub parent for that. So there's 30 other lines that have been crossed to Fallon. We've got hypothetically 150 lines from each of these 30 parents and being developed. So there's thousands of NAM lines being produced. We're hopefully going to start the seed ramp up steps, which is a logistical challenge because I'm nervous to do that at this phase in the field because we don't have that much seed, which means I have to do it in the greenhouse, which is a challenge because of the volume. And hopefully next year we can start going in the field and then distributing to collaborators, but pretty excited about it. Okay, so we'll switch gears now and talk about winter peas. And this picture was taken from last September after we finished planting everything. And it's that moment after you've planted and you've gotten all that preparation and hard work and it's in and you feel good and it's just potential. It's a good feeling. The next few slides are mostly for me as a cathartic exercise. So bear with me, guys. I presented last year in, I think it was like March or something, and I did not yet know the outcome of last winter, and now I know the outcome of last winter and this winter. So
This is turned into like group therapy session.
this is exactly, yep. So here's what the plots looked like in February. And I was tentatively, cautiously optimistic. And it actually looks more washed out here in my screen. You can see more green in the plots and even in some of the single progeny rows over here. We had snow cover, but it kind of came and went throughout the season. And it would melt. And then like right before a big temperature drop, we would get some more. And I looked at the station weather data and I don't believe it because it was said that there was like a consistent 5-inch snow depth in the field all season long, which I think that the snow was maybe piling up at that weather station because there's like a fence and there's all these gadgets, and so it was kind of a safe catch. Whereas, I mean, I went out to the field a number of times, and I think it was oftentimes only an inch or two. And then we had that Arctic blast that came through. I don't know if you guys remember, where it was not above negative temperatures for a long time. And I think if the snow depth is not very thick, then we have problems. So that's February, and here is March 27th. So it's not, it's still washed out. Yeah, it's not green anymore. The green that you do see is pennycress, looking great, popping up. Yeah. So not only that, then as the soil starts to dry, we have these cracks that start to develop. So this is actually a picture from March of last year, and you can see all these huge cracks. And what you can't see in this picture is that in the planted rows, the cracks go right along the furrows where the seeds were planted. So if you go and look at the plants, the roots are entirely exposed. So not only have they taken all this winter beating, but then they're desiccating as the soil dries out. And if you get a cold front that comes in then, without any snow cover, that super cold air will fall down into the cracks and stress them even more. So I think it's a double whammy, and they're deep. So this is, I just took a flag and dropped it into one of the cracks, and this length is like several inches. That's how deep those cracks were. So I was thinking it sure would be great if there was perhaps a like turf grass that could be like broadcast seeded, and then like knit the soil together and hold it together. And then, well, but maybe if they hold the soil together, then this might survive, and then you would have a cash crop for the first year of establishment, hypothetically. Yeah, so that was the winter, but not all is lost because we've been collaborating with the Cover Crop Breeding Network, and so this is a group that goes across the United States. And we've been increasingly partnering with them. So we provide sessions for them to test at multiple locations. And so here is what last year's. So this is the 2024/25 winter, not the most recent ones. And what you can see is that in North Carolina and Maryland, there was not a whole lot of winter kill, as you might expect. The winter peas did fine in those locations for the most part. But in New York, they had a really nice selection year. And so in this chart and then the chart on the left, the blue lines are Minnesota lines. And then the red lines are checks, and the green lines are ones that have been developed by the previous winter pea breeder, the USDA winter pea breeder. So that'd be like the lines that the legume cover crop had been developing prior to me.
What year is this?
2024/25. So not this last one, but the one before. And so I take heart in that this New York means we have a number of lines that are competitive with these checks. Now, just as a caveat, there's some weird shenanigans going on here because Wyndham and Blaze are not the most hardy varieties. Survivor and Wild Winter are much hardier than Wyndham and Blaze, just based on how things survive in Minnesota in any given year. But for whatever reason, with their spatial variation, those lines did well. But I think that basically through this collaboration, we have a way of testing material and making selections for material in an environment that's not quite as severe as Minnesota. And, you know, breeding is a slow and iterative process, right? We're not going to be able to stack all the winter hardiness alleles all at once. You have to get ones that are marginally better and then cross them and stack them for multiple rounds. And this provides an avenue to try to do that.
So it looks like for the New York, is the table just New York data?
Yes.
And in the figure though, looks like there's a blue line that's got the highest survival.
Yeah, well, so when I had made all three of these at once, they were sorted by their multi-location means. This is just done in jump. So that's why if you like look over here, there's your Wyndham, which is actually like higher than this line over here. So they're sorted in the x-axis here based on the multi-location means, which are inflated by the other locations too.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Whereas this is just New York, which was a more selective place.
I got a question. I'll say that.
Yeah, based on did you look at the winter weather conditions and environmental data to see like why, like if maybe it's a different mechanism or something between, you know, the reason The ones that didn't do as well, Minnesota did well in New York, maybe it's different winter stress, right?
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a great point, right? Winter stress, winter survival, and cold hardiness are really complex traits. And there's lots of different mechanisms or lots of different ways for the weather to kill a plant and different mechanisms to try to fight that. I did not look at New York's data to see what exactly is going on. I don't know to compare it, but I would imagine that I think they had decent snow cover last winter, and obviously their temperatures, they never got the Arctic blast that we did.
Anecdotally, for now, I guess, Becker was our toughest location for Camelina.
Yeah.
And so I think desiccation is a big issue too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's common.
Kind of
Yeah.
combo.
Yeah.
So maybe some of your more drought hardy winter peas might be better. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And those two traits often go together, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another one from Pete LaFontaine. Something I've wondered about with a lot of the breeding programs, how much do you prioritize lines that are resilient for a worsening milk cycles?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot because because I've been doing this for pea breeding for like 5-6 years now. And the first 3 years here were pretty great. I reflecting that I was actually quite fortunate in how good those first years were because I was able to get good field data on the variation amongst the winter pea germplasm for how well things did. But the last 3 winters now have been terrible because there's not been any snow cover or not great snow cover. And is that a climatic shift?
There were some bad years before.
Yeah, well, yeah, I know that it's, you know,
You gotta broaden your window a little bit.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a climatic
Yes,
shift. Like if you think about the projections of where our climate's going, it's a bit of an anomaly. It's part of a shift in just the variability of our winter.
yes, that is very
So
visible.
the variability is definitely in all the climate models, but actually the upward trend is that we're getting wetter and a lot of that wetness is winter snow.
But it's
So-
coming more as precipitation and not, or as like liquid precipitation, not snowball,
Yeah.
which is bad news bears.
Yeah, I was almost wondering, like, when you think about selecting these lines for winter hardiness, like, what does that look like exactly? Because like, would it make sense to grab something from like a place that isn't like cold but icy instead of cold and snowy?
Yeah.
Because the soil, because in a snowy place, it
Yeah.
might not get that cold in the soil.
The trick is that for the early generation material, I don't have enough seed to throw it to a lot of locations to test in different kinds of winter stress environments. So for now, my goal is to get it just to survive in the hypothetically most friendly environment in Minnesota and maybe like New York. I think, you know, in breeding, you get what you select for. So over multiple years, we're going to be exposing our stuff to different kinds of stresses, and the ones that rise to the top are the ones that are hopefully the most resilient to that kind of increasing variability. Hopefully. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but
Yeah, I mean, we just,
that's
the more
multi-year,
locations you can test in, the more, because you never know what winter's gonna get.
more locations and more years. But you can't do that too well until you have more advanced stuff where you have seed to do it. And that's been a real challenge for me.
On that note, how does your breeding program work? Like, do
Yeah.
you have any markers?
Is it the next slide?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, we'll get there.
Sorry.
Go back. So I have a quick question here. So your blue, your copper forest from Minnesota, these environments, are these winter by winter crosses or are they
Yeah,
winter by
these are
spring?
just winter by winters.
Okay.
I'll talk about that in a minute too. Yeah, right. So how do I deal with that? Everything dies every year. We grow it again in the spring. We don't plant everything we have in the fall. We keep a reserve and then plant it in the spring. And that can be challenging too, because when you plant winter peas in the spring, they flower later than they should. They flower later than the spring peas do. And then especially the winter peas, which haven't been heavily bred for all kinds of disease resistance, they get all kinds of diseases. And then they also get heat stressed as they're trying to fill pods. So your yield is not very good comparatively. So it's the way I get around it, but it's
Just for like
Awesome.
heat increase,
Yeah.
basically.
yeah.
So kind of piggybacking off that though, I know you did a planting date study. What would the later planting date in the fall more optimal or mid or early?
Yeah, so there was some variation for me for the winter peas in general. The 10th to 20th of September in St. Paul is the magic window where it's most optimal. There were some lines that seemed to be fine going sooner, and some lines that were fine going later. The less vigorous ones tend to want to be planted sooner, and much more aggressive ones are fine going a bit later.
It's different in Camelina, I think. I think it's later is a little better in Camelina, but there's the fertilization.
For most winter crops, later I think is better, right? Like
Right.
barley, you're
Yeah.
going in October.
Yeah,
You don't want them to grow too soon.
but yours doesn't have fertilization quite.
No, so peas don't have true fertilization. They're just photoperiod sensitive,
Okay.
and they need to have a number of nodes before they flower, and there's a number of alleles for that. That photoperiod sensitivity locus, whatever, is one of the main QTL you can use to select for winter hardiness peas because it has a lot of pleiotropic effects.
So something interesting too, do you think there could be any temperature interaction though with that? Like day length and temperature interaction?
I think I would need lots more years to parse that.
Yeah,
Lots more years of data.
get into the climate change stuff. It might be something to keep an eye on instead of thinking like, okay, we've got planting date dialed in.
Yeah,
You
so
might have to try.
yeah, I mean,
That would go back to some of the other issues about just getting something that lives through the winter in any case.
Yeah.
And then dialing in what exactly the cues are.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, when we did that timing day trial, I think it had closely matched what Don had mentioned. Like he said, we did this way back in the day. You're just doing the same thing. And then the results matched, I think, pretty closely what he had said or what he had seen. But I think it is still prudent with shifting climates to every now and then reevaluate and see how things did.
Yeah.
Sounds like a great grant opportunity. So these are pictures of various winter pea lines that we harvested last spring, the end of the spring. And some of them are early generation, other ones are late. But I just wanted to show a picture of what winter pea seed looks like because I'll later show spring pea so people can see the difference. They're ugly. No offense, winter peas. Some of these are close to food grade, like this seed right here. Oh, those are great. Love them. But this line, ofta. So we forage on, we grow stuff in the spring, and we keep making our crosses. And so this is kind of the running tally of all the crosses we've made. My goal was to get to 500 crosses a year or more to really stir the pot and mix things up and then evaluate. But if you notice, last year, these numbers are a lot lower than the previous years. What's going on, Steve? And it's not just because Prakriti and Pete were being really lazy. We had a number of really unique problems in the greenhouse this year. The biggest and nastiest one being mice, which is a problem I've never seen before or even heard about. And apparently they largely only targeted our pea greenhouses. Yeah.
You know, we, I think, we're really bad too, but. So we don't.
We would crosses, and not just this, in our NAM greenhouse as well, and the pods would start to grow and fill. And then as the pods were filling, they would climb in, ignore all the mouse traps that we had left everywhere, climb up the plants, and then rip open the pods and eat the seeds out of them. So it was like a nightmare.
Count the number of crosses you made and you're successful.
Yeah, it would be like over 600 or something. When it would like lots of were made,
Yeah.
lots of were attempted.
Yeah.
And then also when that Arctic blast came through, there was a pipe that was like spraying water and it froze. And so then the irrigation, like the timed irrigation didn't come on because the pipes were frozen. And so the plants got dried out also at that critical time where the crosses are trying to establish. So it was challenging, but we forge on. Just to explain to people what's going on here, we're doing winter pea breeding and spring pea breeding. The vast majority of peas are spring peas. So genetically speaking, that's where our reservoir of all the good alleles that we want for things like yield and disease resistance and seed quality. That's where all that stuff comes from. Winter peas, they're only good for winter survival. And so to get those traits in, we need to cross the winter by the spring. So that's what these crosses are all about. And this last year, we focused really heavily on disease resistance because last year, no, 2 years ago, the winter peas that did survive our winter got slammed with diseases because we had a really wet spring. And so I pilfered through the USDA germplasm collections notes and tried to find lines that were highly tolerant, or as tolerant as I could find for Phantomyces, root rot, Ascochyta leaf blight, and Fusarium root rot, which are like the main 3 diseases we get around here. Our most advanced lines that are going to be going into the field this year are F6s. From a breeder's perspective, you can only kind of treat them as an F6 because there have not been that many rounds of real selection on them because they have died the last several winters. But they're advanced, so they're hypothetically more genetically homogeneous.
What's the picture of the winter type that's super modeled? You know, is that an F6 that has like?
No.
Looks like it's segregating for seed color. Is that one right? Or is that just like a mix of a ton of?
Yes, it's an earlier generation line segregating. The really dark color is some sort of stress that I'm not entirely sure what exactly is causing it.
Oh, so it's not just like seed color.
Yeah, so in addition to the brown modeling, which is what you see here, kind of, there can be purple speckling, little dots of purple. And when when varieties that do the purple speckling get really stressed out for something, they'll do that and they'll get purple. All right. Yeah.
Oh, so for your 3-way, 4-way crosses, are you doing like winter by spring?
Right. Yes.
Winter, back to winter?
Great question. Thank you for asking about that because
Yeah.
it comes into effect. So, my thought was the spring is bringing lots of great traits, but it's not helping winter hardiness at all. So maybe we'll take these winter by spring crosses and cross them to a third winter parent to both make it's basically like making a winter by winter cross, but also boosting the survival, hopefully. So that's those 3 and 4-way crosses. We take the F1 of a winter by spring and cross it to another parent, another winter parent.
How many, after that BC1 F1, how many?
I wouldn't even call it BC1 because there's a third, it's a different parent.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I kind of think of them, just like in terms of winter and spring, I guess. But yeah.
So what I do then is we take the F1s of those and grow them out and then get the F2 seed. And then we would throw those in the field and advance. And then we would have enough seed to throw into the field in the winter.
But since it's crossed at from F1 seed is crossed.
Yeah.
Do you look at all those individually since it's still segregated?
I don't try to. You can take, so I kind of do. We have subfamilies, I guess, or whatever, where you have the one common original parent. And so I keep track of that pedigree information and you can. So then I started doing freeze testing, looking at them, and I have to do some heritability calculations and stuff. But the goal, I'm trying to figure out how best to insert this process into the whole breeding pipeline because it really adds a lot of extra time, right? Normally you just make a winter by winter cross or spring by spring cross, and then you can grow the F1 plant in the grow chamber. And then, so we make those crosses in the fall. By springtime, when we're planting now, I have F2 seed that's ready to go right into the field. Whereas this process, we don't have the F2 seed ready until the fall. So it might work for some of these, but we don't have necessarily tons of seed available. And so I've been trying to toy with using the controlled environment grow chambers or freeze testing as a means of selecting them. I've done some work on this, talked about this a bit before. I need to do more experiments to effectively show whether or not freeze chamber selection is effective or not, or consistent. I think the challenge is the chamber and the settings we use. But this was just a somewhat recent study or test I did. It wasn't really like a properly designed experiment. I was just trying to select from these lines, these families.
Killing everything.
Yeah, with killing stuff, but not too much.
Yeah.
And actually, stuff didn't die as much as I wanted. But most of these are 3-way crosses. And there were a couple where it was just the winter by spring. So they were not crossed to a third parent. And those 4 lines are here and here. So it's a mixed bag because some of the winter by springs did very poorly. And a couple did fine. So I guess it depends on the parental selection. So maybe if I choose a really good winter parent to cross with a spring, it might not need to have a third parent cross to it. But if it's a really poor parent or like a moderate winter line, then maybe I need to cross again. I don't know.
The one thought too, so just for a winter by spring, maybe you could have less planets each. You could do like 10 or something of those because it's a straight up F2. But for three-way crosses, you might want more. You might want 30 or something.
Yeah, I think it's a great question because there's a lot more just genetic variability. So you want to kind of maximize how much that variation you're selecting. But the question I pose is it worth it? Should I just stick with the winter by springs? And yeah, they mostly die, but I just select the winners out of them and get rid of the really bad ones that are too spring-like.
I think it's worth it to have three ways.
Yeah, I think you're still we're way up with three-way possibly in terms of surviving.
It's kind of like making another winter by winter cross, but sneaking some spring in.
Yeah.
100%, but
What do you think, Kevin?
I don't know.
So
Much better, sorry. You
Yeah.
really can't get through your slides. You threw it, how much better are, like agronomically, so we're talking about like freezing tolerance or whatever, but agronomically, like how much difference do you see between like two-way versus three-way, four-way crosses, if anything?
the winter P agronomics, I tend to largely, I wouldn't say I ignore. There are certain morphological characteristics, which are all recessive single gene traits that I care about, that I try to select for when I can. Most winter peas don't have those traits. And so most of the progeny don't end up having them, except when I cross with the winters or with the springs. And so generally they have bad morphological characteristics like their parents. And this is the last slide from the winter pea stuff. This just shows principal component analysis using that same set of hundreds of millions of SNPs, but just for the lines that were winter pea, or what I thought were winter pea when I first started this whole winter pea breeding exploration. And so this kind of reflects all the winter pea germplasm that's out there, more or less, sort of. Everything from the USDA that I thought could have been winter. And what's interesting is in this first principal component, we have separation along the lines of winter hardiness. So the coloration, the adjusted field survival ratios are based on the 2 years where we had good field data, good variation for field data for survival. So if they're more red, that's a win. And if they're really blue, then that's bad. And what we see there's all these lines here. When I've looked more deeply, I don't think are winter peas at all. They're spring peas. So these are largely a type of pea called Alaska freezer type, which does not mean that they are winter peas. In fact, they were historically grown early on in the season, like back when Green Giant was getting founded. But they do still actually have genes for winter hardiness. These are lines collected by Gary's dad from the country of Georgia. These are mostly Peruvian lines somehow. And then we have a weird mixed bag of stuff from like China. And then we have stuff from Germany, Russia, Ukraine, around here. And then this section is basically winter pea breeding in the US over the last 5 decades. So we have Melrose, which is here, which is my favorite, in that dark red line, and then a couple other lines which have been identified or bred. Why am I showing you this? The next FGI grant that just got approved, the third objective is to start developing a winter pea multi-parent advanced generation intercross population. And so I'm thinking of trying to combine this phenotypic and genetic data to help choose the best parents. I don't know what you think about that, Kevin, but these are the 8 that I was thinking of. They're largely the better ones, but they are trying to maximize the genetic diversity at the same time. So hopefully we can make crosses, learn more about the genetics controlling winter hardiness, but also develop superior lines at the same time. That's the dream. So I'm going to try to move fast because we are a bit behind and I bet you guys are getting bored. Spring peas. Can anyone guess, not Kevin, what the small grains in the background is? It's oats. All right. So we've been evaluating about 55 spring pea varieties, cultivars, and stuff from the USDA germplasm collection over the last 4 years. So here are what those plots look like, and the adjusted means for the top 10 and top 10 best and top 10 worst performing lines. And you can see last year the yield data was pretty well correlated with 2024, not so great with 2022 and 2023, which were drought years. So interesting. The more wild lines often had better yield in those more drought years, which is perhaps not entirely surprising. My favorite is Apollo. You can see him from the edge of the field. I can, anyways, every time I go out there. Okay. And then last year was the first year where we had multi-location data within Minnesota. So it was pretty exciting. So this is what those like 30 or 40 of those 55 lines look like in Crookston, Lamberton, and St. Paul. And I'm not sure why Lamberton did so poorly last year. We did have weird, bad emergence, germination. So I don't know if it was like really wet and we had some root kill off or seed damping or whatever. But Crookston did surprisingly well. I guess the piece liked the cold environment, and we still have Apollo, the king, at the top in St. Paul. But just breaking down the variation, location was the huge driver of the variation we saw, and then genotypes, and then their interaction between genotypes and locations was still quite significant. So that'll be interesting to look at more in the future. And then people like pictures, so here is what a really nice forage variety pea looks like on the 15th of June and then 15 days later on the right. So here it's kind of misleading, but this is about at knee height. And then here the plants are lodging and falling over already because 15 days later they're like at belly button level. These are the two best grain variety peas. So you can see they have a shorter stature and a semi-leafless leaf phenotype, and they have white flowers. So those are all the key traits. And Apollo, who's the champion. Even when Apollo gets up to chest height, it doesn't really seem to lodge. So it's pretty good. We haven't been doing the spring pea breeding as long as winter pea. So our most advanced stuff for now are F34 rows. That's what we'll be planting this spring, based on single plant selections that we did last year.
And still planting by hand.
Yes, we are.
Did you
and we're gonna
my message that our little planter works for soybean?
I did, and so we need to test that. I think we're going to try to. I don't know if it'll still work for us this year because I want to increase the spacing between the plants in the row, so it's easier for us to make our selections. Because when we put all the seeds together, they tiller out and they weave together because they're a vine, and so it gets really hard late in the season. They start flopping over and going into each other, and it gets hard to separate them. So we're going to try to space the plants out a bit more.
But do you still do it with a
coat? Yeah. Do we do it? We still do it. I plow it and then we hand plant.
Like more of a planter one with space.
We don't use a planter. We put them by hand.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh.
It's like archaic.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's room, I think, for technological improvement. Historically, just so people know, I've been nervous about using a lot of small grains equipment because I've experienced in the past situations where the pea seeds, since they're like nice spheres, they roll onto like the belt cones. And so seeds that were supposed to go one plot end up in the next plot, which is like catastrophic and terrible for breeding. So no thank you. These are what spring peas look like. So much prettier. So these three are food grade, wonderful, nice yellow spring peas. These ones tentatively look fine. You can't really see it on this picture unless you're looking at your laptop, but there's lots of split seed coats, so no good. We have like a virus going on with this one, so no good. And then these two have like a gray or kind of dusky seed coat, which is undesirable, so no good. But there are some lines that look pretty good. I'll quickly talk about pea intercropping. Kevin's been waiting to hear about. So for this test, in a previous study, we saw that there was potential that when peas were intercropped with different oat varieties, the combined yield of them for their grain outpaced the oat monocrop, which is not always the case. Sometimes adding peas to an oat monocrop drops the overall yield because there's competition or whatever. With Kevin's help and with Nick Betts, that's his name, we put together this test looking at 5 oat varieties and then 5 spring pea varieties. I tried to match my pea varieties to the maturity date that Kevin had, the data that Kevin had for those 5 varieties. Kevin can probably talk more. Some of these are very much just meant for grain, whereas some of the other oats can be used for forage as well. And that's the same for these 2 peas. These 2 peas, Maximum Organic 4010, are forage peas with normal leaves, and they get really tall, whereas the other ones are semi-leafless and shorter, so they're meant for grain. And I also tried to match the heights as much as I could. So I think those are the 2 key traits when you're trying to do intercropping to try to match, and it's not easy. And so there's 25 potential combinations of oats and peas together. We had all those 25 combinations plus each pea monocrop and oat monocrop, all those together with 3 replications in a randomized complete blind study. And so these just show how they looked over time. You see that jump in 1 week? It's crazy. And then they're flowering. So this is getting close to harvesting for forage. And then here you're harvesting for forage when things start flowering. This might be a little late for the oats, I'm not sure. This is rains, so rains flowers really early.
Did you actually harvest? Oh yeah, it did.
Yeah, so for each plot, there were 10-foot plots. For each plot, we split them in half randomly, and half we harvested for forage at the time when you would harvest for forage, and then the other half we let go till maturity, which is tricky, and then harvested them for maturity because the maturity dates for the peas and the oats don't always overlap, and that's a real problem because neither oats nor peas hold each other up very well when they get really late in the season. So then you have like loss potentially or shattering.
What is the maturity date?
With the stuff that I look at, it can vary a lot. For the spring peas, there are lines that I think most are around like July 15th, but they can go like July 1st to the end of July. So this is the forage data. And let's just break it down real quickly. I'm going to move this thing over to the side so I can point at stuff. So we have these different groups. We have peas grown just as a monocrop. So this is what Amarillo's forage and Apollo's forage looks like, yada, yada. And then here we have rains compared with those 5 peas and M and Pearl compared with those 5 peas. And the blue bars represent the oat monocrops forage yield. So the 2 things, I think, the 2 comparisons to make are how do pea forage do when they're added into an intercrop? And it's a mixed bag, but peas tend to do, the overall forage yield tends to increase. Peas as a monocrop, you get less forage than if you mix them with oats, which is not surprising. Oats are going to be the primary driver of both forage and grain yield. But perhaps the more interesting comparison is how do each of these oat varieties do as a monocrop versus mixed with these different pea varieties? And I'll just remind you that the organic 4010, which is this blue, and Maxim, which is the orange, those are forage varieties. So they should do better. But that doesn't always seem to be the case. And I would say that we don't have enough data to make any meaningful comparisons because it's all over the place. And I think most of the differences are not significant and it's just 1 year of data. So we have this going in the field again. Hypothetically, even if the yield is not significantly different, if it's maintaining the bar for the total overall forage that's been harvested, that's a boost for farmers because peas have really high protein content that's easily digestible. So it's more valuable forage, but you can't have just pea forage alone because it's too high protein. You have to cut it. So this makes a much more valuable overall forage than just oats or peas alone. So that would actually be a pretty exciting result if it doesn't statistically change the yield. And here's pretty much the same type of chart, really hard for you to read because it's small, but for the grain yield. So in each of these sections, we have the 5 oat varieties. The black line on top is the oat variety as a monocrop, and then the different pea varieties added in. So for example, here we have the oat variety Rains with CDC Amarillo, and that's the variation for the total grain yield. Whereas this is the total grain yield when you have just the oats, the Rains variety by itself. And I think this is kind of exciting because oftentimes there's certain varieties, the Amarillo and the Apollo, the yellow that you can't see and the golden color that you can kind of see, oftentimes they increase the mean of the yield, the total grain yield. Again, not statistically significant, but we just need more data. There's too much variation going on. So what does this mean? I think it means there's potential for OP intercropping. We need more data, but it's exciting. Minnesota is one of the largest producers of oats, and we also grow a lot of peas in Minnesota, but they're for vegetable production, for like canning and freezing. So I don't think they'll really fit with this purpose. But anything that gets farmers to grow more peas and more acreage in Minnesota is a plus. So, and that's it. We're getting late on time, so I won't talk about protein. Questions?
One thing that would be interesting to look for with your sequence data, just to see if there are a few lines or accessions out there that just maybe have less repetitive elements.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's expensive to sequence, yeah.
Yeah, they're huge genomes, right? They're almost 4 gigabases, so they're like 4 times a soybean to get through.
Yeah, and then we're looking to do some sequencing on some outgroups as well. Not whole genome the way Steve described, but you look at the size of those genomes and they just get bigger. Like the relatives are like 5, 6.
All the Lazarus, yeah, they're monsters.
So there's no easy way to model a pea genome without lots of repeats.
Yeah. Is there any way to reduce repetitive elements with CRISPR?
One by one.
Yeah, hopefully not one by one.
Yeah, you can try fast neutrons or something.
Yeah.
We'll reverse the millennia of adaptation or whatever,
Yeah,
expansion.
right.
That'd be awesome.
You find an old frozen pea from the archaic times, from like early human civilization. Yeah, I don't know, it's wild. Build a huge,
Yeah, it's a challenge, but it's a good one.
Have you planted your spring peas in the fall to see if any survive?
We throw in a couple like Bridger as a check for the winter peas, and they do not survive in Minnesota. I also include Bridger as a check for when we do freeze testing, and it usually dies. It doesn't always die, but it usually does.
We haven't just got very many spring barleys, but there are differences.
Yeah, so one fun fact to note about Melrose, to bring it back to Melrose, it was actually derived from a cross between a winter pea, Austrian winter pea, one of them, and a spring pea, like one of those Alaska type, freezer type spring peas. But it is more winter hardy than its Austrian winter pea parent. So there's alleles there to be mined. Thanks.
In your good stuff in New York, the slide, okay.
Yeah.
Was Melrose a parent in a lot of those good crosses?
I don't think so. Mostly like I need to rehash some of those older crosses and give them to evaluate. So like I made lots of crosses with Melrose early on. And I was trying not to redo the same process. So, but things have been so harsh here. Like maybe I should regenerate some Melrose crosses for that environment, see how they do. I think they would do well.